So, when I sent out the brushstrokes email to you all this past week, I was only half joking when I suggested that you pull out your secret decoder ring as we read Genesis 14, 1 through 16 together. It's a somewhat cryptic passage, at least to our contemporary way of thinking and processing and reading. And so let's call cryptic our English power word of the week. If you're building an English vocabulary, this is a word you need to know, cryptic. If something is cryptic, it is mysterious, it is obscure, it is hidden, it is concealed. Now, if you make something cryptic, you are encrypting it, which we talk about all the time with our internet stuff these days. You need to encrypt your page. You know? But if it's cryptic, it is kind of hidden. So Genesis 14, 1 through 16 is a bit cryptic to our way of thinking. The meaning of this passage is not real clear with just a simple glance. You kind of casually look at it and you're going, whoa, what's going on here? It doesn't make... You have to get your decoder ring out and you have to work at it to figure out what's going on here. Now, I spared the scripture reader this morning from having to struggle through this passage. And I'm going to read it for you in a moment in my paraphrase version, the authorized Boydston paraphrase. And there are so many tongue-twisting, unpronounceable names that are repeated numerous times in the passage, over and over again. And they are obviously intended to anchor the passage, the story in history. And by the way, this is the first time in the Bible where there is an attempt to connect the dots between secular historical records. That's why all these kings are named. Secular historical records where there are chronicles of kings and kingdoms that were kept in secular sources, as well as God's story. And then there's this kind of back and forth description in the first 10 verses that almost give you a sense that you're listening to the Abbott and Costello Who's on First comedy routine. You're trying to figure out which person they're talking about as you're going through this, going, whoa, what, back and forth. And then on top of that, as we're trying to analyze this section of the Bible, we realize that God is not mentioned even once in there, in this block of Genesis 14, 1 through 16. And we're sitting there as we're reading and we're scratching our heads and we're trying to figure out how all of this fits into the broader flow of the Genesis story. And that, I suggest, is the whole purpose of the encryption, to engage the reader, not so much to hide what is happening, but to make us think harder and to work through what's going on here and where it's all going. So, I want you all to get your decoder rings out. I'm going to read to you the authorized Boydston paraphrase of Genesis 14, 1 through 16, and I've tried to simplify the language a bit, and I've done some summarizing of the names, but you still have to tune into the passage to catch on what's going on here. And you know, be ready, because I might ask you what's going on here. So, you might find it helpful to read along as it's printed on the message guide. On the inside of the green sheet, the message guide is printed here if you just want to follow along. The 4 regional kings of Shinar, Elasar, Elam, and Goyim, declared war on the 5 kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Adamah, Zeboim, and Bera, or Zor. These later kings met up in the Sidon Valley, that is, the Dead Sea area, and formed a 5-king military alliance. For 12 years, the five-king alliance had served the king of Elam. But in the 13th year, they revolted. In the 14th year, the four-king alliance attacked tribal groups in the territories of the rebellious five-king alliance. Then the five-king alliance went to battle in the Siddim Valley against the four-king alliance. And the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah retreated, or as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah retreated, they were defeated at some of the many tar pits in the Siddim Valley. However, the others in their alliance survived and fled to the hills. The victorious four-king alliance plundered Sodom and Gomorrah, carting off everything of value, including the food. Abram's nephew Lot was living in Sodom at that time, so they took him and all his possessions too. One of the survivors showed up on the doorsteps of Abram, the Hebrew, who lived near the oaks of the Amorite Mamre, the brother of Eshcol and Aner. They were all treaty partners with Abram. When Abram heard that his nephew had been captured, he mobilized. That was an incoming call from Ethiopia. Pastor Simon. When Abram heard that his nephew had been captured, he mobilized all 318 of the loyal household men trained in combat. They pursued the four-king alliance army as far as Dan. Then during the night, having split his men into small groups, Abram attacked and defeated the alliance army, chasing them to Hobath, north of Damascus. He recovered all the loot, including his nephew Lot, Lot's possessions, wives, and people. Got it? So, who would like to take a stab at summarizing what's happening here? Just, give us a brief little, what do you see happening here?
There's a war.
There's a war. Okay, good job. Good.
Between four kings and five kings.
Between four kings and five kings. What else happens here?
Four kings won.
Woo! Four kings. Okay, what else? Who was captured? Abram's nephew, who is named Lot, got captured. Yeah.
And then they went after him.
Then they, being Abram, went after him. And what happened then?
They split up into small groups.
Split up small groups and attacked, and
got them all back along with possessions and everything else.
they were victorious. Everybody lived happily ever. Well, not everybody. But you get the point of what's going on there. Very good. Here are a few observations that I think should help us line up the letters on our decoder rings as to what all this means. Number one, there is no end to the political squabbling. There is no end to the political squabbling. While we are committed to staying engaged in the political process, we have to realize that the ultimate solutions are not political in nature. Even if my favorite party comes to power, and I do have a favorite, it's only going to be temporary. Someone is going to try to grab power, and even if you're doing a great job, caring for the nation, looking, doing well, and those guys that are trying to grab power are going to try to their best to make you look bad. They're going to try to make you look incompetent so they can have a chance at having power. They want power. People lust after power. People lust after control. And they're actually willing to fight to protect what they see as belonging to them. And that's what's going on in these first 10 verses. Political squabbling. Abram is the contrast. He is not fighting for power or control. There's no indication in the passages, in the sections we've read about Abram so far that he is at all interested in power or control. But he's obviously moving or moved out of family loyalty. He senses an obligation to Lot, and so he responds to Lot's situation. But that still does not change the political landscape. Even after this gets settled, there are going to be many more political squabbles that are going to rise up. Number 2, Lot has a bad case of stupidity. But he gets rescued anyway. Lot has a bad case of stupidity, but he gets rescued anyway. Last week, Lot got greedy, right? When we were looking at chapter 13, he got greedy. And when he was given a chance, instead of doing the gracious thing, he chose the best land for himself. Then also last week, we read in chapter 13, Genesis 13, 12 to 13, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot settled near the cities of the valley, and pitched his tent close to Sodom. And then verse 13 adds, almost parenthetically, and says, the citizens of Sodom were lowlifes. They were evil and sinful against the Lord. And now, by chapter 14, we read that Lot is actually, he's no longer living outside of Sodom, right? He's now living in Sodom itself. And that's how he got swept up by this four-king alliance army. Yet, in spite of his poor choices, and there are multiple small, poor choices that got him into this situation, in spite of his poor choices, Lot gets rescued. God's man, Abram, extends God's grace. So much for getting what you deserve. We can't take credit for all the good things that happen to us. We've all done way too many stupid things to even think that way. Any blessing we receive is in spite of how we've handled things. And once we embrace that as a reality, we start to step away from the stupidity itself and move into the wisdom zone. And the question is, will Lot, and those of us like Lot, ever make that leap into the wisdom zone, or will he be forever stuck in the stupid zone? Stay tuned. There's a lot more coming.
So to speak.
So to speak. Number 3. Abram has become one famous and powerful dude. Abram has become one famous and powerful dude. He even has a nickname, or is it a title? Verse 13. Abram the Hebrew. He's called Abram the Hebrew. And by the way, this is another first in the Bible, in this chapter and in the flow of the biblical story. This is the first time that the word Hebrew appears. And it appears to be a title that is applied to Abram. It could be that Hebrew is a variation of the word Habaru, which means something like unattached mercenary soldier, which would fit well with the incident in this story. It's also possible that it is from a different word, ivrit, which means to cross or cross over or to pass over. And by the way, that is probably the most popular explanation by the scholars of where the origins of the word Hebrew come from. And there's yet another possibility that it is the term Hebrew is derived from the name of Abram's ancestor Eber. And you'd find him in Genesis 11, 14 to 16. But the point is that it has become a title of some sort that has been applied to Abram. Abram the Hebrew was becoming a famous and a powerful dude in the area. People knew who he was and possibly where he was from. They knew some of his story. He was influential. They referred to him Abram the Hebrew. He'd become a big deal without even trying. As a matter of fact, Abram is so big that he is able to defeat the powerful four-king alliance. Number 4. Chapter 14 makes the best sense when we read it in light of God's promises in chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 14 makes the best sense when we read in light of God's promises in chapters 12 and 13. Remember, each time that God promises something to Abram, the promise seems to expand, doesn't it? It compounds. So in chapter 12, God approaches Abram and he says, leave your land and your family and your father's household for the land that I'm going to show you, and I will make you a great nation and will bless you, and I will make your name respected, and you will be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse, and that means I'll have your back, and all the families of the earth will be blessed because of it. Then in chapter 13, God reframes the promise, and he says, from the place where you are standing, God is talking to Abram, he says, look at and gaze to the north, south, east, and west, because all the land that you see out here, I will give you and your descendants forever. You're going to control the real estate market. I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth. If someone could count the bits of dust on the earth, then they could also count your descendants. And so here, in chapter 14, we're starting to see the fulfillment of those promises. Abram has a big household. It's, you might say, the beginning of a nation. He's able to rumble with kings. God's protection is there. And he has control of the land. It's really happening. It's really starting to happen. Number 5. Even in the midst of craziness and instability, God is a promise keeper. So you should trust him. And by the way, this is the key point this morning as well. Even in the midst of craziness and instability, God is the promise keeper, so you should trust him. This was not a real stable time. It was not a stable place. Kingdoms were at war with each other over petty things. Abram had a set of treaty partners of his own, according to verse 13. And yet, in the midst of all that instability, the biblical writer wants us to see that God is in the process of keeping the promises that he had made to Abram. You know, we tend to think that God is at work when things are calm, when things are moving smoothly, when everything's going like the machine is all geared to, it's all coming together. We say, God is really blessing me. God is giving me this new job. God says, all these great things are happening for me. This is really a blessing from God. Everything's under control. This is a time of great blessing. But so far in the Abram story, we've seen an immigrant who becomes a refugee because of a drought. He fails to protect his wife, and she's grabbed for Pharaoh's harem. God intervenes with plagues, and Pharaoh says, get out of here. And Abram is deported. He now has a record. He's been deported from Egypt, and he returns to Canaan. And then there's this war that catches Abram's It sweeps up Abram's nephew Lot. He wasn't involved, but he was in the wrong place, and he got swept into this net of war. And one day, Lot is a man of great means. And the next day, Lot and his entire household are slaves. And all their possessions are confiscated, and they are being dragged off to who knows where. These were not happy days. These were not what you would think of as the blessed days. They were rather days when you tend to think that God has gone AWOL. Do you ever have days like that? Days when you think that God must be sleeping at the switch? Do something, God. Well, where are you? I can see these trains coming, and you don't have to wait till the last second to do something. Days when you start to doubt. Yet, in the midst of the craziness and the instability, God is the promise keeper. So you should trust Him. In the times when things seem to be at their worst, those are the times when we need to trust God the most. And those are the times when He is perhaps the most busy doing His thing behind the scenes, which is where most things of significance actually take place. So, we should embrace the slogan, "In God we trust." It says so right here. In God we trust. In our national context, it's become kind of this trite and meaningless slogan that we paradoxically print on our money, of all places. Most people say, I don't trust God, I trust money. And yet, that does not in any way invalidate the message itself. Maybe your life has turned confusing and you're hoping for this decoder ring to make sense of all of it. There's just too much for you there are too many moving parts and details, and you're just, oh, my head hurts even thinking about all this stuff. If somebody could turn the decoder ring and get the secret message that must be in there and make it make any kind of sense. Trust the promise keeper. I mean, from where we sit, we realize that the fulfillment of God's promises to Abram have turned out even grander than anyone could have imagined back then. Abram turned out to be a bigger deal than what it sounded like even to begin with, even with all the hyperbole about, sand and stars and, gazillion acres and all that stuff. Through him, through Abram, we ended up with the Messiah, born through Abram's great nation. A Messiah who didn't just defeat an alliance of 4 little self-absorbed kings, but who defeated the Prince of Darkness and who secured the rescue and the release of all people through His victory over death. As we heard Alex read in John 11, death itself is no longer in control of our destinies. So even if you have a terminal disease, that is not the end. We have a hope that transcends. 1 Peter 1:3-5. May the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ be blessed. On account of His vast mercy, He has given us new birth. We have been born anew into a living hope through the resurrection of Christ Jesus from the dead. You have a pure and enduring inheritance that cannot perish, an inheritance that is presently kept safe in heaven for you. Through His faithfulness, you are guarded by God's power so that you can receive the salvation He is ready to reveal in the last time. Jesus is the decoder ring that helps us make sense of all the craziness we endure. You see, it's not really about us, is it? Even Abram's story is not about Abram, and it's not about Sarai, and it's not about Lot. It's about God, the promise keeper. You can, therefore, and you should, therefore, trust Him. That's the point of the story. After all, He has given us Jesus, who is the greatest blessing of all. For as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, His kingdom will overtake all little petty regional kings and demagogues and local squabbles and all the craziness that we go through and endure, even at work. Stick with Him. You can trust Him to keep His promises. And believe it or not, that is the good news. Who would be willing to share a story of how you see God working in your own life, or ask a question, or maybe you have a comment about Genesis 14 or what's going on here, or something you're trying to sort through?
I think that what you discussed was normal human behavior. So if that's what it is, it hasn't changed for thousands of years, so what's your choice? Really, the only choice is God.
Are you going to trust Him? Are you going to trust Him as His promises? Yeah, it's so interesting if you start looking at parallels between situations and say, you know, this really is not a whole lot different than the stuff we're going through. We got these crazy leaders too, that are wanting to fight each other and take each other prisoner and underage. There's some craziness out there that's, what is this? And it's really tempting to become discouraged.
Like you said, you know, that promises are, that's your craziness. You can trust and follow Him, things will be right.
Yeah, and everything does not have to line up properly according to how we think it should in order to be trusting God. And maybe we should be trusting Him more through the chaotic times, because those are really the times when we step up. We need to step up.
I think have two sides. One side is when you get a bad choice, then God still rescue us in a chaos situation. I'm sure this one. But when we got a bad choice, and even God rescue us, but maybe we still have to suffer the consequence of our bad choice. This is the first side. But the other side, even we get the best choice, but sometimes we still will run into the chaos situation, and God will rescue us, and then God will turn the best. How to say, is the best situation become a good thing.
He will turn that which was not good into what is the best.
Yeah, through the chaos, maybe you get a very, very good news. Good
Yeah,
things,
and
it's compound.
Yeah, which
also.
is the point of Genesis, right?
Yes.
The whole
It's
book, if you
wonderful.
read the last section of verses in the book of Genesis, that's
Yeah.
making that exact point.
Yeah, so I think it's the double side, two sides. So based on what we choose the bad things, God will rescue us, but we may suffer the consequence.
There are
we
consequences.
choose.
Yeah.
But when we get a good choice, even we suffer in the chaos situation, God will rescue us and turn the bad things become very, very good. And this one is the surprise for our
He's
life.
in the process of turning the bad into his
In
good.
the new.
Into his good. And that it doesn't matter whether it's because of your own stupidity
Yes.
that caused it, or whether because you live in a world where
the
there's
situation by the environment.
yeah, and we look at our own selves. Some of us are here because we're in our situations because we've made poor choices, or some of us are here because we've been refugees out of poor choices of others have made, and so we've had to run in order to, and we consider the open door the opportunity.
Example. Yes.